7. LA Machine. One morning shortly after the designing, West was sitting in his office with the door closed, staring at schematics. Deadlines lay impossibly near at hand. One of the group's veterans, observing the scene outside West's office, remarked, "The tension among the kids was phenomenal. I could just feel it." Now in the cubicle across from West's door, a couple of members of the micro team began to laugh. First one, then the other, then both of them, more and more raucously. A moment later, Carl Alsing's phone rang. It was West. "If you don't shut those guys up, I'm gonna kill 'em." "He was ripshit," said Alsing. "I had to go out there and tell them not to laugh. It was awful. I felt so embarrassed. I felt like one of those old supervisors from the 1800s who used to hire children and make them work 18 hours a day." West took a day off and went to look at sailboats. One Sunday morning, the team's official day of rest, West was at home, trying to lose himself in the newspapers when the water pump in his house broke down. Throwing the papers aside, he went to the basement to fix the thing. For him, this was a trivial task. He knew just how to do it. He had scarcely begun, though, when hitting some minor setback, he grabbed the pump and hurled it across the room. He stood there, staring after it. If he had done that, what might he do next? In order not to find out, he went upstairs, told his wife to call the plumber, and went right to bed at midday. What was wrong with West? Wasn't the worst behind them now that they had finished the design? He didn't want to talk about it. He merely shook his head. Now, early in the new year, something like the computer existed in the form of two partially assembled prototypes. But Eagle wasn't even the equivalent of a pocket calculator yet. The team now had to make that computer work. They called this part of the project debugging. West had told Ed Rezala to draw up a debugging schedule that would bring Eagle to life by April, the date West had named for the bosses. West had gotten manufacturing to send down some senior technicians from the factory in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, both to bolster the ranks of debuggers and to get manufacturing involved. Rezala had put the hardy boys on 2 shifts. West had prescribed 8 hours of work for Saturdays. They had made some progress, but now it was coming painfully and slowly. In the local idioms, they were moving 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and the debugging schedule was slipping a week. West had assumed that debugging Eagle would resemble the debugging of eclipses. He had been deceived. You had to make many parts of Eagle start working. It now appeared before you could really begin to fix it. This because of certain new features which everyone agreed were sexy. West couldn't ignore the evidence. He didn't know how to debug this machine, and he could not make himself believe that Rezala and his hardy boys would figure it out for themselves. That fall, West had put a new term in his vocabulary. It was trust. "Trust is risk, and risk avoidance is the name of the game in business," West said once in praise of trust. He would bind his team with mutual trust, he had decided. When a person signed up to do a job for him, he would in turn trust that person to accomplish it. He wouldn't break it down into little pieces and make the task small, easy, and dull. To Alsing, West still had that knack for making the ordinary seem special. And the way West said trust made Alsing wonder whether either of them had ever heard the word before. But West prided himself on his skills at debugging, and by repute, he excelled at it. He wanted to go into the lab and will the machine into life, Alsing thought. But if West barged in there now, he would be admitting that he didn't trust his team after all. So West was staying away from the lab and instead was banning laughter outside his door and throwing water pumps around. Most every day now West called Alsing into his office, closed the door, and asked, "What's really going on in the lab, Alsing?" Wasn't all this excessive? If you set a preposterous schedule, don't you figure that it can slip a little? "True," said Alsing, but not to the point. "If you say you're gonna do it in a year and you don't take it seriously, then it'll take 3 years. The game of crazy scheduling is in the category of games that you play on yourself in order to get yourself to move." It was a game in which new hands were always being dealt, a little like poker, perhaps. West and his staff had created the deadline of April, and in the act, had agreed at least to pretend to take it seriously. Many months later, Carl Carmen would say that no one upstairs believed they would finish Eagle that soon. Some evenings downstairs, West seemed to say the same thing. "We're gonna finish this sucker by April, Alsing," he'd say. "Yeah, Tom, sure we are," Alsing would reply. They'd smile at each other. Sometimes, however, when, for instance, Alsing came in and told West that the micro team would probably miss some intermediate deadline, West would say, "Come on, Alsing, this schedule's real." Now, on an evening early in 1979, Carmen brought West a piece of momentous news. North Carolina was going to miss their own deadline by a huge margin. What did this mean? That the game of internal competition had essentially ended, and the game of outlandish scheduling had begun in earnest. West had always maintained that Eagle was crucial to the company. Well, events were proving him right. But that was no cause for celebration. Meeting that preposterous deadline of April, when Eagle should be free of all bugs, was no longer merely desirable or just a matter of pride. It had become a corporate necessity. At least that was the message West thought Carmen gave him, the message West decided to receive anyway. West sat in his office brooding about it for a long time. Depending on who you were, you saw West's narrow office either as the lair of an ogre or as a haven with a door behind which you could talk privately. And if it meant the latter, it was, depending on the day of the week and the time of the day, either a place to talk nervously about impending disasters or else to use as a kind of lounge. Steve Wallach, Carl Alsing, and Ed Rezala looked forward to their collective weekly meetings with West. He held them in his office on Fridays at 3:00 p.m. They'd do some business, West would tell them the latest company gossip, and like Alsing at his own meetings with subordinates, West might submit to what Alsing called zingers from his troops. "We could be in a lot of trouble here," West might say, referring to some current problem. And Wallach or Rezala or Alsing would reply, "You mean you could be in a lot of trouble, right, Tom?" It was Friday, they were going home soon, and relaxing, they could half forget that they would be coming back to work tomorrow. In the mornings, if West took Alsing into his office, it was usually to ask such questions as, "Is this real, Alsing? Is this gonna work, Alsing?" Alsing called these episodes time out to worry. In the evenings, however, West could ask Alsing those same questions with a wry smile, as if to say, "Weird trip we're on, Alsing?" And the question of whether this project was real would usually lead to a little mutual rumination on the meaning of the word itself. Alsing sometimes encouraged members of the micro team to visit West's office after 6. They would enjoy it, he promised. None seems to have taken the advice, but Alsing was right. At that transitional evening hour before hurrying away toward his farmhouse, West would leave his door ajar like an invitation, and leaning back, his hands fallen still, he would entertain most any visitor. But on the evening after West heard the news about North Carolina, nightfall brought no relief. The game of what's the earliest date by which you can't prove you won't be finished scheduling had been switched on West. Or he had switched it on himself. There was no essential difference. The debugging wasn't going well, and West had a wild air, as if his office were a cage. He started out talking with his hands in his lap, keeping them busy by twiddling his thumbs. His hands kept getting away, though. He pushed back his hair. He drove his index fingers up under the bridge of his glasses. He made fists and his fingers exploded outward. "I was selling insurance before. Now it's the big crapshoot, all on one number. Now I gotta get way out on the edge, full of anxiety about the company falling into a revenue hole if it's not there by April. 10,000 jobs on the line, and I gotta pretend everything's fine. And there's a lot of pressure in that. I can't afford to appear too scared around here. I don't talk about it. In the first place, no one outside of here is interested, and I can't talk to people around here and say, 'Here's how I'm manipulating you.' Carmen says the company's in a lot of trouble if it's not there by April. Suppose I quit, I could just say, 'Fuck it,' and go. I'm not gonna do the next machine. I'm gonna give somebody else a chance to fail. I'm gonna get totally out of computers." West stopped once in this long, unusually bitter monologue to say, "No, we wouldn't have a disaster. We'd back and fill." He seemed to be saying that he had to make himself believe that dire consequences would ensue if his team missed its deadline. In a moment, his reason seemed clear. "It just gets so scary I can't even talk about it. I may have to take Rezala into the lab and work on that thing myself 12 hours a day. When you're doing that, you carry it with you everywhere you go. At some level, purely me faces me. I better be up here just crackerjack every morning fixing that thing. Every morning I gotta wake up and think, 'Oh, Christ, can I do it?'" West took hold of the arms of his desk chair as if he were about to get out of it and head for the lab right then. "Rocking back here in my chair and talking about doing it is one thing, but it makes me worry. It gives me a nauseous feeling because I'm not doing it." West didn't go into the lab that night or on the working days. One Sunday morning in January, however, when the team was supposed to be resting, a hardy boy happened to come by the lab and found West there, sitting in front of one of the prototypes. Then one Sunday, West wasn't there. And after that, they rarely saw him in the lab, and for a long time he did not even hint that he might again put his own hands inside the machines. Whether West accomplished anything or not on his Sunday trysts with Eagle, no one ever knew. But sometime after he called an end to them, he said, "We're way beyond what any one person can do. It's too complex." A senior member of the micro team had wanted to create special micro-diagnostic programs for Eagle, and West had turned him down, thinking that the regular, higher-level diagnostics would suffice, as they had for debugging eclipses. Now he relented. Later, the micro-diagnostics would become very important. Opinions varied on how much they assisted then, but it seems that they did help the hardy boys surmount the first awful barrier: how to fix the machine enough so that they could really fix it. For a while, West continued to take Alsing aside and ask him if they really were making progress in the lab. Gradually, even those queries ceased. Alsing, who often had the feeling he was watching a movie, believed that a scene ended there. His leading man had finally mastered restraint, and in the running commentary Alsing was keeping through me, he recorded, "This week Tom finally gripped the arms of his chair and decided to trust Rayzala." When West described the other engineers on his staff, Wallach and Alsing, he boasted about their technical attainments. Of Ed Rayzala, he said, "His biggest strength is the guy does not give up. He's in there when most other people go belly up." Rayzala was West's trustiest lieutenant. From the top of his head, the dome of it bald, to his feet, usually shod in construction boots, Rayzala looked big. He wore a thin mustache and beard. He delivered firm handshakes and hearty hellos. "How you doin'?" he'd say. "He talks very fast," observed Alsing. "It's almost a speech impediment. Sometimes I feel like giving him a shot of Valium and then telling him, 'Okay, Ed, say it again.'" It was odd, but sometimes, even when just saying hello, Rayzala's voice carried a sarcastic sound, as if he was mocking himself for what he was saying. On an evening at the end of January, down in the basement, Rayzala walked up to one of the doors labeled Restricted Area, unlocked it, and led the way in, down a corridor, around a bend, through another door and into a room with yellowish cinder-block walls on one side and on the other a movable partition. The chamber wasn't much bigger than most suburban living rooms, and it was more cluttered than many. It had a floor of linoleum tile and no ceiling, but instead a tangle of metal braces, heating pipes, and, hanging down into the room, many thick black electrical cables. On a gray metal table lay a number of large bound books and loose-leaf binders with such labels as Eagle Micro SEQII and ATU PALS. In a gray metal bookcase next to one wall stood published volumes with titles such as Bipolar TTL Data Book. Rayzala stood near the center of this chamber of exotic initials, arms folded on his chest, and nodding across the room said, "Here are two state-of-the-art computers sitting there." And there they were at last, the object of anxiety. A pair of eagles, standing a few yards apart from each other along the cinder-block wall. They were just two blue metal frames, their tops about level with Rayzala's shoulders. Machines in this state are said to have their skins off. Inside each frame, exposed to view, and somehow that didn't seem right, was a shelf full of what are called wire-wrapped boards, thin plates, each with one side covered by a profusion of tiny wires. Small cables, flat like tapeworms, ran among the boards, and farther inside, below the shelf, hung many bundles of multicolored wire. Oh my, there were a lot of wires. At the base of the frames in metal housings were the fans that keep the machines from overheating. The fans' steady roar filled the room. The two prototypes looked identical, except for their names. Taped across the top of each frame was a piece of paper. One read Coke, the other GOLLUM. When the machines were first put together, the team had planned to call them Coke and Pepsi, but Ken Halberger insisted that one be named Gollum, after the sinister, spidery creature in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And for some time that winter and spring, Gollum was in fact the more interesting machine, the one on which they met the most intricate problems. "They're not too impressive at this point in time," said Rayzala. He meant the machine's looks, not their abilities, though he would have been right in either case. Equipment much fancier looking than the prototypes themselves surrounded Coke and Gollum. On top of each sat a Micronova, Eagle's therapist, with its blue plastic skins on. A system console, a chair, typewriter, and printer attended each prototype, and a magnetic tape drive stood next to Coke. On TV and in the movies, a tape drive often appears in order to signify the presence of a working computer. That must be because the reels of tape spin jerkily and thus show that something is happening. But in fact, mag tapes represent some of the least important and slowest parts of a computing system. The real action takes place inside the boards. To get a look at it, you need special tools, and they had them there, of course. boxy little machines called logic analyzers. The analyzers sat on low-wheeled carts, like pieces of surgical gear. They were covered with switches, and each had a small oscilloscope screen. At this moment, on one screen, a strange shape etched in white lines stood frozen, and on another danced shifting geometrical patterns. In essence, Rezala explained, these machines were cameras. They took pictures of what happened inside the computer. The analyzers could not look into the chips, but you could hook their probes to the pins of a chip or to wires connecting boards and take several different kinds of snapshots, as it were, of the signals coming and going. The analyzers also contained little memories. When the clock inside Coke or Gollum ticked, every 220 nanoseconds, every 220 billionths of a second, that is, the analyzer would take a picture. It could take and save 256 snapshots during a given foray and play them back on demand. "It's funny," Rezala said. "I feel very comfortable talking in nanoseconds. I sit at one of these analyzers and nanoseconds are wide. I mean, you can see them go by. Jesus, I say, that signal takes 12 nanoseconds to get from there to there. Those are real big things to me when I'm building a computer. Yet when I think about it, how much longer it takes to snap your fingers, I've lost track of what a nanosecond really means." He looked at me. "Time in a computer is an interesting concept." Then he excused himself. Time in all varieties weighed upon him, and out here it was time to go to work. We had come in at the changing of the shifts. The second shift, which often became a graveyard shift, was just coming on duty. Little early, as usual, everyone came early and stayed late these days. Ken Halberger, who is short and handsome, was sitting in front of Gollum. Rezala joined him. Rezala looked like a giant beside him. Halberger was Rezala's second in command, and you could see from the easy grin Rezala turned on him that they were friends. "It doesn't loop on fetch, Ed," said Halberger in greeting. Shirt sleeves, jeans, and corduroys. Mustaches, beards, and neat shoulder-length hair, jogging shoes, and hiking boots were in fashion inside the lab. I stood near the center of the room. I heard Rezala cry out, "Whoa, what did you put in for an address? I'll give it all FS for the hell of it. Whoops, that didn't help your float much." Questions would be asked and never answered out loud. An engineer sitting alone at Coke said, "The program blew away on me. I don't know what happened to it." But he seemed to be talking to himself. Gradually, the scene shifted. Some of the hardy boys put on coats and departed. A few others came in. Then Rezala sat down at the central table and took up a sheaf of papers. These were engineering change orders, ECOs. They contained descriptions of recent fixes that the team had made in the boards of the prototypes. The ECOs mattered because the engineers were working on different problems in each of the machines. After they fixed a problem in one, they wrote up an ECO so that they'd know how to make the same repair in the other. In his list of 17 rules for the lab, Rezala had written this commandment. "All boards should be updated each morning so that we can ensure that each board is in the same state." Apparently, the crew hated this job. Rezala said they were always putting it off. "For the sake of forging ahead with new problems," he said, "I'm thinking of enforcing the rule." Rezala rocked back in his chair. "Let's figure out what we gotta do." The others turned toward him. He leafed through the thick sheaf of ECOs, saying, ATU, ATU, ALU, ALU, and then of course we have the anonymous problem. He made a sour face. The other engineers had come near, warily it seemed. Halberger said, "Well, Commander, what do we do?" Rezala looked at them from over the tops of his wire-rimmed glasses, and with a faint, Western smile, he held aloft the sheaf of ECOs. Josh Rosen, a black-haired young man, said, "Oh no, not me, I did that last night." As Rosen turned away, Rezala stared at him, a lingering gaze, his eyebrows slightly lowered. Then he lifted them and looked at Halberger, who said, "Okay, I'll do the ATU." Rosen was over at Coke. The others, Rezala and Halberger and a technician, sat down before a long bench on the opposite wall. Each laid a wire-wrapped board down in front of himself. On one face of a board lay neat rows of the little boxes that housed the chips. The other side, though, was pandemonium. Snarls of thin wires were attached to the hundreds of pins that came out of the chips and extended through holes to these undersides of a board. The wire-wrapped boards rendered a vision of the Jekyll and Hyde phenomenon. Each engineer laid his down with the face of Hyde up, and each focused a high-intensity lamp on it. Halberger would pick up the board he was working on and peer into the spaghetti-like maze as if he were nearsighted. Rezala left his board on the table and bent low over it. They all followed the same careful routine. Locate the pins from which a wire is supposed to be detached. Make sure these are the right pins by testing with an ohm meter. Unwrap the wire gently with a small, hollow-tipped tool. Throw that wire far away, locate the pins to which a new wire should be attached. Wind the new wire on, test again with the ohm meter, and go on to the next echo. About 10 minutes went by in silence. Then Halberger said while peering at his board, "I've got a 2A here, is that meaningful?" "Yeah," said Rezala, but he didn't even look up. Half an hour went by. Rezala pushed back his chair, lifted his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. "The thrill of debugging the machine," he said to me. "We do this ourselves rather than have a wire person do it. You're so prone to make mistakes with this. We may be a little more cautious. Then again," he pulled himself back to the bench, "we may not be." The fans in the two eagles droned on behind the bent backs of the engineers-turned technicians. In a while, Rezala turned to me again, holding up before my eyes a pair of tweezers. I looked closely. The tweezers held a tiny strand of wire. "One of the problems," he said. "It was awfully easy," he explained, "to drop a sliver of wire this size in among the thick nest of wires on the back of a board. And if that little fragment should get lodged in the wrong place, it could cause the machine to commit failures of the sort known as flakies. Debuggers could spend hours, even days, finding the cause of such a problem." I said, "It's like surgery." "Well, not quite," said Rezala. "Most problems we create are repairable." I laughed, but he wasn't finished. "Most surgery isn't," he added and went back to his labor. When it came to working on the machine, Rezala had no truck with incomplete thoughts. "I come from a conservative background, from the beer-drinking generation. I'm into sports. My wife's into being a housewife, so I don't have dreams of grandeur fundamentally about going out and building the next evolution of the computer." The first few times I talked to him, Rezala described himself in long, rapid sentences like that one, and he spoke them with an edge in his voice that seemed to say, "You probably think I can be sized up like this. I'm a poor Polish boy. I come from the slums of New York. I have a high school equivalency diploma and would rather play softball," he said. In fact, as he later told me, his father came from Poland, and Rezala grew up in an apartment in Brooklyn. But it wasn't the slums, and what he really remembered was a home where you never went hungry and you knew from an early age that you were going to college. Both of his parents worked. His father, a waiter for Child's restaurants who read a great deal on the side, taught himself from a book to fix TVs and made a part-time business of it. "Both my parents are very smart," said Rezala. His older brother was a math whiz and wound-up valedictorian of his class at Columbia University. "Pretty good," said Rezala, "considering my mom has a high school equivalency diploma and my dad never went past 5th grade. Although not a bad student, Rezala had the misfortune of following his brother through school, and from the elementary grades on, his teachers never stopped reminiscing about his brother. "From grade school on, it was always my rap. I never lived up to my potential," he said. He didn't sound bitter. He seemed to believe it was a matter of fact. Rezala went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and studied electrical engineering, including logic design. But this was during the early 60s, and he never laid hands on a computer until he went to work at Raytheon, right after college. Rezala never had the feeling, which others in the Eclipse group remembered, of having his true calling suddenly revealed to him the moment he touched a computer. And it took him 7 years, he said, to recognize the opportunities and pleasures of working. "To me, it was more important to play softball, take karate lessons, and play hearts at lunch." At Raytheon, he carved out for himself an undistinguished, comfortable niche, doing routine assignments. When he finally did get an assignment that he could not fulfill by looking up answers in books, he worked hard and succeeded, somewhat to his own surprise. That project whet his appetite, but he knew he had established a reputation for being an average guy, and he did not think other interesting assignments would come his way at Raytheon. To shuck that reputation, he decided he had to start over at another company. In a trade paper, he saw an advertisement for Data General, not one of the early, brazen ads, just an ordinary listing. "Engineers wanted." On a whim, he drove out to the company's headquarters and said, in essence, "Here I am." Engineers and executives, including Carl Carmen, interviewed him on the spot, and Rezala was impressed. "At Raytheon, I never even saw someone at Carmen's level." Data General offered him a job that very day, and he accepted their terms without so much as an argument. "I wasn't very good at bargaining, I guess." And he went to work, not on the job he thought he had been hired to do, but on a piece of the hardware for the first Eclipse. "I was had," he recalled, and he smiled. When Rezala arrived, all that remained to be done on his part of that Eclipse hardware were finishing touches. West, who was just another engineer then, noticed Rezala, however. He liked the dogged, straightforward way in which Rezala went about finishing up. As Rezala himself observed much later on, with Tom, it's the last 2% that counts. What I now call the ability to ship product, to get it out the door. Rezala looked at me squarely. And I may not be the smartest designer in the world, a CPU giant, but I'm dumb enough to stick with it to the end. West called himself a mechanic, one who could take the ideas of engineers technically brighter than he and make those ideas work. He thought he had spotted that quality in Rezala, too, and he had promoted it. West groomed Rezala as a leader of hardware teams. Eventually, he put Rezala in charge of the hardware for the biggest of the 16-bit eclipses, the M/600. As often happened, the pace of that project became frenetic. It took a year of increasingly intense labor from Rezala, and when it ended, he felt tired. He was looking around for something easy to do when West asked him to manage the development of Eagle's hardware. Rezala declined. In his office, the door closed. West schemed. "How am I going to get Rezala to sign up?" he asked, Alzing. Unlike Wallach, Rezala wasn't a student of advanced architectures. Rezala wasn't worried about Eagle's supposed inelegance. He was just tired. Offering him a chance for vengeance wouldn't work, because Rezala had been pounding out the M/600 during the ego wars, and he didn't have anything to feel vengeful about. Rezala was a hard one, West said. Bringing him to the signed-up condition was mainly a matter of persistence. West presented Eagle to him as a test of strength. Could they get this machine out the door on time? Again and again, he told Rezala that the company needed this machine desperately. Rezala never actually said, "I'll do it." One day, it seemed to him, he was just doing it. For months afterward, he would come home at night and his wife would ask him, "How was your day?" "It was terrible," Rezala would tell her. But as he went on describing the day's events, his wife noticed, he became increasingly excited. "Maybe it's masochism," Rezala said. "But I guess the reason I do it fundamentally is that there's a certain satisfaction in building a machine like this, which is important to the company, which is on its way to becoming a billion-dollar company. There aren't that many opportunities in this world to be where the action is, making an impact." It struck him as paradoxical, all this energy and passion, both his own and that of the engineers around him, being expended for a decidedly commercial purpose. But that purpose wasn't his own. He had enjoyed his years at Raytheon. Life had been pleasant there, and he had been an easygoing fellow. Now, in the Eclipse group, for several years in a row, he had been working overtime without extra pay in an atmosphere that was decidedly not easygoing. Why had he made the switch to Data General and now signed up to work on Eagle? Rezala said, "I was looking for." He ticked the items off on his fingers. Opportunity, responsibility, visibility. What did those words mean to him, though? Rezala shrugged his shoulders. "I wanted to see what I was worth," he explained. More than anyone else in the Eclipse group, Rezala borrowed expressions from West. Fundamentally, basically, the win, some notion of quick and dirty. The ubiquitous canard, the long, drawn-out and as in, so-and-so says such and such on, it's a canard. But Rezala tended to qualify and expand, as if he feared ambiguities, whereas West was inclined in his daily commerce to the short, forceful sentence. West's words and phrases just didn't sound the same on Rezala's tongue. The team was having problems with one of the support groups. They believed that this group was slowing Eagle's debugging. This group wasn't trying hard enough, which was to say they were working just normal hours on Eagle's behalf. "They believe Eagle will fail," Alzing thought. He could see it in their eyes, he said. West stood in a corridor discussing the problem with Rezala. "I'm gonna detonate those guys," said West, in a flat, calm voice, as if he were planning a business trip. Then he promised to waste them. He added, "We'll string them up by their toes." Months later, looking back, Rezala decided that when West took on people in other groups and beat them up, as this sort of activity was called, he did so in a purposeful way, one that was usually not so much mean as intimidating. In one fairly typical case, a support group missed a promised deadline. At a meeting, West questioned the group's leader. The leader said that he hadn't received a certain piece of equipment yet. West would not let the matter rest there. He wanted to know why it hadn't been shipped and what was being done about it. West was always pushing, Rezala noticed. But the act, Rezala would come to believe, was never as dramatic as the language West used to describe either what he was going to do or what he had actually done. For a long time, however, Rezala took West's descriptions as a fairly literal model of how to contend. And when Rezala confronted a troublesome support group, he beat his fist on the table and shouted and made open threats. I saw him after one such encounter, returning to his cubicle. He was red. "I don't want to beat people up," he said, throwing his hands down. "I don't want to be a bad guy. I just want to get something done." He took some deep breaths, then proceeded to explain that it really wasn't the support group's fault. Eagle wasn't their machine. They couldn't be expected to work as diligently on it as the Eclipse group. Bob Beauchamp remembered, by way of drawing the contrast between West and Rezala, receiving a set of orders from West. "Do this," West said to him, and in West's tone of voice, Beauchamp heard, "No ifs, ands, or buts, no arguments, no commenting, no nothing, just figure out how to do it and get it done." "Did it work?" "Yeah, it worked," Beauchamp said. "When Tom said do something, people did jump." He went on, "Rezala was practicing that, I think. He could bark too." Beauchamp grinned. He and Rezala were good friends now. Before they were, early in the project, Beauchamp was standing around with one of the Hardy boys one evening, talking casually, when Rezala came out of his cubicle and, looking them up and down, said, "Don't you guys have work to do?" "What the hell?" Beauchamp thought to himself. "It's after working hours." So he said to Rezala, "No." To Beauchamp's surprise, Rezala didn't say any more. He just walked back to his cubicle. "Then I knew," Beauchamp said. Rezala participated in West's campaign to create the illusion of a machine before one existed, and on the whole, Rezala endorsed the strategy. But he worried. Clearly, he could not make West's approach his own. "We're getting the rest of the company geared up now, and we could fall flat on our face. This whole thing scares me because we're pushing." At West's insistence, he had made up a debugging plan that would bring Eagle in by April. Then he made up one that would bring the machine home by May. In mid-March, when Rezala knew that they wouldn't come close to that second mark either, he went to a meeting with West and heard his boss insist to a number of people in others' groups that they would have all the bugs out by May. "Now May 1 is the target and we're not gonna do it," said Rezala when he came back. "It's sort of a poker game. Everyone's bluffing, but everybody seems to know the rules of the game, and I don't know those rules yet." He continued, "I strongly believe in supporting my boss because I know he'll support me. So I try to be consistent with what Tom is saying, one, and two, I try to be as honest as possible." One day, Rezala bought a self-help manual that promised on its cover to hold the secret to understanding one's boss. "Just a few minutes after I first met him, Rezala told me, 'I'm not a bright guy.' I wrote that down in my notebook, and for the rest of the evening he kept saying, 'But I'm a dumb guy.' 'I must be, you wrote it down.'" Rezala was far from dumb, though. He was just somewhat puzzled and at the same time bent on self-improvement. When Rezala said something earnestly, if they failed, it would be his fault, no one else's, he told me, for instance. You never felt that he meant something else. Somehow he found the time, after working what usually amounted to a 10 or a 12-hour day, to drive into Boston one night a week and take a course in a new programming language. He was going to fill in the gaps in his technical education, and he would not skip a class, not for a snowstorm or even a ball game. Most engineers, I think, consider themselves to be professionals, like doctors or lawyers, and though some of it clearly serves only the interests of corporations, engineers do have a professional code. Among its tenets is the general idea that the engineer's right environment is a highly structured one, in which only right and wrong answers exist. It's a binary world. The computer might be its paradigm, and many engineers seem to aspire to be binary people within it. No wonder. The prospect is alluring. It doesn't matter if you're ugly or graceless or even half crazy. If you produce right results in this world, your colleagues must accept you. It's an exciting environment to contemplate. You can change the way people think if you can provide the right reason, and you can predict the way in which others may change you. Since there are only right or wrong answers to questions, technical disputes among engineers must always have resolutions. It follows that no enmity should proceed from a dispute among engineers. Clearly, West believed in these precepts. Designs were right or wrong. Engineers were winners or losers, and those judgments had nothing to do with whether he liked them personally or not. But there were many reasons to doubt the reality of this binary world. What had the ego wars proven, but that talented engineers can dispute narrow technical issues and never come to agreement? Amazed at the alacrity with which West sometimes consigned engineers around him to the status of winners and losers, and convinced that West was usually right, Alsing nevertheless always wondered to what extent West made his own judgments come true. Rezala had always believed that a technical argument between two engineers couldn't lead to hard feelings. But he had recently lost his oldest professional friend because of what he had imagined to be a technical disagreement. An engineer was supposed to be eager to advance in his company's hierarchy, and Rezala was, but he had other dreams. Some years before, he had taken a trip to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and ever since, he had wanted to go back there and do something simple. He thought he'd like to open a grocery store in Jackson Hole someday. To Rezala, many of the young hardy boys seemed hip and cultivated in ways that were foreign to all his previous experience of engineers. But he did not for that, or any other, reason disapprove of them, and he didn't seem to envy them or want to change his ways and be just like them. He talked about them with plain curiosity, as if he were a traveler in their country. One evening, over beers, Rezala complained about some insipid movie recently shown on TV. He compared this stinker to the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, an example of a film he'd liked. Actually, he had admired the protagonist most of all. "I don't know why," he said. "She's romantic, foolish, unrealistic, everything an engineer's not supposed to be. But I like her." He gave a short nod as if to say, "This decision is final." Then he said it again. "I like her." Rezala wasn't West, and he wasn't dumb either. He seemed to be in transit. When the hardware team started to design Eagle, Rezala opened a sort of diary. It reads like the journal of a frontiersman's travails, except that instead of wolves, hostile Indians, and busted wagon wheels, the reader encounters the indecisiveness of logic designers, an affliction that causes a designer to spin from one possible approach to another. The regular breakdown of the computer they were using to work on their computer, and the tendency for all bright young engineers to redesign and redesign in search of perfect, unattainable solutions. In the diary, one delay follows another. Schedules always slip. The last entry, recorded several months before they stopped designing, reads, "Overall, things look lousy." This was the biggest job Rezala ever had, and he was just finding his way around in it when he wrote that journal. I got the impression that a few engineers doubted his suitability on the grounds that others were more brilliant than he. Rezala himself said, "I'm an implementer. I'm not gonna go out and invent anything, but making it work is fun. It's something I think I do reasonably well. I don't have Wallach's knowledge. I'm not on top of the architecture per se, but I'm a good designer, I think, and I'm a better debugger." The sheer physical complexity of the machines demanded that the debuggers plod, and plodding did not always come easily to the quick, bright, hardy boys. Were signals just barely making it to their destinations between ticks of the computer's clock? If so, they had better go back and work on problems they thought they had solved. Was there a lot of noise inside the machines? Noise, as Rezala explained it, is what makes your TV go haywire when you turn on your blender. Stray voltages that are propagated through the machine. And too much noise fouls performance. Noise is not the most interesting of problems, but coping with it requires experience and imagination, and a certain doggedness. On one occasion, the hardy boys found that while one board was failing, another one, identically wired, worked right. The problem they discovered lay in a single chip. They wanted to throw that chip away, put in another, and go on. But Rezala would not allow it. The suspect chip might not be defective. It might just be working a little more slowly than most of its kind. In that case, they would have a real problem to fix. It might never show up again in the lab, but when the time came to mass-produce this machine, it would almost certainly come back to haunt them. Some slow chips were inevitable, and they had to provide for them. In the main, Rezala's technical role was to play the brake. When the hardy boys complained loud and long about updating boards every day, he bent the rule, but insisted that they perform this crucial, unpleasant task every Saturday. When he put them on 2 shifts, he made a point of working the better part of both. He was a good West Pointer. He led by example. Rezala took a week off from the debugging that summer and spent the time building a porch on his house. I came by one day to give him a hand, and got a dose of his style of management. He lived in a fairly new house, of quasi-colonial design, located in one of the many residential neighborhoods that had sprung up in the area more or less in rhythm with the growth of the numbers on the bottom line of Data General's annual reports. The numbers had grown faster than trees do. His house lay so close to headquarters that he could have ridden a bike to work, although, given the traffic nearby, it would have been a dangerous commute. While working with Rezala, I made a careless reading of a carpenter's level, and we consequently made the frame of the porch just a shade cockeyed. Rezala stood back and stared at the frame for a while. Then he said, "Ship it." He teased me about the mistake in a friendly way. He also prodded. When I arrived, he said he expected to finish the entire job that day. Around 3 in the afternoon, I said I was tired. "Tired?" said Rezala, reaching for a tenor's high note. Tired? You're not tired. How can you be tired? You mean to say you're tired already? Somehow I felt I had to keep working. An hour and a half later, we still weren't finished, and then I really felt tired and said so. Rezala let go on the instant, brought out some beer, and declared the day a success. For most of their time together, most of the Hardy boys got along well with Rezala. He teased them and he prodded them, and they did the same, both to him and to each other. One evening just before going home, Halberger made a minor, careless mistake. Discovering it, Rezala told the rest of the crew, "I hope you're gonna leave Halberger a nasty note. He'd leave you one." Rezala liked a contentious atmosphere, a vigorous, virile give-and-take among himself and his crew. "Smart, opinionated, and nonsensitive, that's a Hardy boy," he declared. Above all, Rezala wanted around him engineers who took an interest in the entire computer, not just in the parts that they had designed. He said that was what was needed to get Eagle out the door on time. He wanted the Hardy boys to bind into a real team, and he spoke with evident frustration of engineers who were reluctant to work on boards that someone else had designed, who felt comfortable only when working on their own. Josh Rosen, he believed, was only one of those who felt this way. "Rosen designed the ALU and he wants to work on the ALU and nothing else," Rezala complained. "But I have a good confidence level on that board. It's not the first priority now. I need him elsewhere." Much later, Rezala would say, "I realize now that Josh wasn't as comfortable with the ALU as I was." Back then, however, his feelings were different. It seemed that he had given up trying to win Rosen over. When he spoke to Rosen, Rezala's voice had an edge to it, like the one it sometimes had when he was describing himself. He teased Rosen from time to time. "Your ALU is not fast enough to keep up with this blazing machine, Josh," he told him one night in the lab. Rezala often spoke that way to Hardy boys. The difference was that the others usually answered him back in kind. Rosen, on this occasion, just turned away. The days of the debugging wore on. In March, West said, referring strictly to the debugging, "Most of the fear is gone now." He was speaking only for himself, however. The team had passed through the first sharp fear, but they had designed the machine much too fast for prudence. It had features that none of the group had dealt with before. At this stage, none of them dared claim to understand in detail how all the parts worked and fit together. Sufficient cause for worry about the debugging remained. Alsing thought that even under the best circumstances, several kinds of fears inevitably attend to debugging. One was the fear of the big mistake, the one that would be discovered late in the game and would require a major redesign, and with it, perhaps, a fatal delay. There was the flaky fear that they had designed Eagle and were debugging it in such a way that it would never be reliable or easy to build in large numbers. Rezala had that one fairly well in hand, but there was also the boogeyman fear. "Just something dark and nameless," said Alsing, "that the machine just won't ever work." West said, "It's the infinite page fault you didn't anticipate. The boogeyman is the space your mind can't comprehend." Once in a while, Alsing said, he suffered a form of this last anxiety. "Maybe these guys writing the microcode are really bullshit artists, so full of shit they don't even know they're full of shit. Maybe this whole thing is bankrupt." Such thoughts came to him rarely, usually at night. They vanished when the sun rose. Probably they stemmed from the fact that Alsing wasn't writing this code himself or reviewing it closely. Rezala once remarked, "Yeah, the further you get from doing it yourself, the more demons you see." Gradually, Rezala came to own, having acquired the title to it from West, main anxiety over the machine. Anxiety became just something he lived with like a bad back. For a while, I engaged in a ritualized conversation with him. "How's the machine, Ed?" "Ah, la machine," he would say. "Let's see. How is it?" He would pull his chair up to the chart of whatever debugging schedule was currently hanging on his cubicle wall, and usually wound up explaining why they had fallen behind this schedule, too. One day he answered the question differently. "The machine, it's what everyone calls it. That's the whole thing to build the machine." When Rezala heard that phrase, he thought of a movie called Duel, which he had seen on television a couple of years before. In it, the hero is chased by a trailer truck for no apparent reason. Throughout the movie, as Rezala remembered it, neither the hero nor the viewer ever gets to see the truck's driver, if there is one, but only the front end of the semi looming like a huge evil face in the hero's rearview mirror, always threatening to drive the hero off the road, always returning just when it seems that the hero has escaped from the thing at last. "My favorite movie," Rezala said. His 5-year-old son, the older of his 2 children, soon found out his father's weak spot, and now when he got angry at Rezala, the child would say, I hope your machine breaks, Daddy. At night, when the last Hardy boys got ready to go home, they would leave Coke and Gollum running one of the many diagnostic programs, a long list of tests that the machine had to pass before it could be called truly functional. Usually they'd leave the prototypes running a test that they had already mastered. At home, in the middle of the night, Rezala would sometimes come awake with a start. He would not be conscious of having dreamed. He would awaken and find himself wondering if one of the machines had stopped working for some new, unknown reason. Or he would wake up thinking about the latest failure, the one whose cause they'd been looking for a whole week and still hadn't found. The boogeyman, La Machine, was there in his bedroom,